Welcome to this brief overview and demonstration of Saint's capabilities to support the Cyber Essentials program. Cyber Essentials is a UK-based, industry-supported scheme to help organizations protect themselves against common online threats. Cyber Essentials represents UK government's minimum baseline standard for cybersecurity for organizations of all sizes in the UK. The annual renewable certification scheme is aligned to 5 technical controls designed to prevent the most common internet-based cybersecurity threats, to include user access controls, security configurations, security update management, firewalls and routers, and malware protection. While no single technology can provide a solution for implementing and testing every requirement within these controls, organizations and assessors alike can utilize technologies to assist in assessing the implementation and effectiveness of many of these controls. Saint's risk-based vulnerability management solutions offer many capabilities to reduce the time to assess organizational resources as they apply to Cyber Essentials. The following demonstration will illustrate the various capabilities within Saint's products and highlight recommended scan policies and reporting capabilities to decrease the overall time and associated costs with your assessments. Within this demonstration, we want to highlight some key areas. First, how to configure scanning engines and local agents that set on the assets to be assessed when it's not technically possible to use remote scanning engines. Setting up scan jobs, and going over recommended scan policies that apply to the controls, running and checking scan status, selecting and consolidating scan data for reporting, and creating reports from Saint's Cyber Essentials report template. That includes the default settings, filtering only on severity scores that apply to Cyber Essentials, the severity ratings between 7 to 10, using custom severities as an optional capability to be able to group those findings by their severity scores to create one column that has one severity score versus the NIST severity ratings. Adding logos and headings, saving custom report templates based on unique local settings, and saving, printing, and emailing these reports. Within Saint's capabilities, the first thing we want to go over is how you set up the scan capability to be able to reach the assets you want to scan. So under the Manage tab, there are a couple of different options. We talked about scanning engines. We call Saint Scanner nodes. And in this configuration, you're setting up a scanning engine that can reach those assets to be scanned, whether that scanning engine is internal to a network and reaching back out to this management console, or you're using a cloud-based scanning engine and using something like VPN to get remote access into an internal network or to reach cloud assets to be assessed. In this example, we see a few where we've got something set up in a Rockville area, and right now it's an inactive scanning node. And using something to scan in AWS, so we have a scanning engine located in Amazon Web Services to scan a virtual private cloud. And then the local scanning engine to this cloud console that can scan other external resources, or use VPN to use that scanning engine to scan an internal network. And then we have a customer's internal scanner to be able to manage and scan into that resource. Optionally, you can use host-based agents. And with an agent-based capability, the scanning capability is using a local service on the asset to be assessed, whether that's a Windows resource, Mac, or different types of Linux, Ubuntu, Red Hat type of operating systems. And in that instance, you're setting up an agent or a service on the asset. And then when you need to do your assessment, the asset is reporting back through that agent the findings from that local agent. So one is doing remote scanning, where the scanning engine reaches into an environment, identifies live targets and scans them. An agent-based assessment is the opposite effect, where individual assets reach back out to the manager. So once that capability is set up and you understand how you want to do the assessments, Saint scanning jobs are the mechanism to be able to create a package that identifies the environment to be scanned, the type of scan policy you want to run, and then the assets to be scanned, the scanning engine or the agent you're going to use, and then the scheduling of those scans. So the first step is just to set up a scan job. You give the job a name and a description if you like. And next is to set the scan policy. Within Cyber Essentials, there are three main policies that we do recommend that you run. First of all is software inventory. And by using an authenticated scan, you're able to obtain the software list from the assets that you're scanning. And as Cyber Essentials requires, to be able to look at what software is running on a host and give you better information about what software might be running as not authorized. Additionally, vulnerability scanning. We recommend the full vulnerability scan policy if it is the only policy that you run. And whether you're using credentials or not, the full vulnerability scan attempts to run all applicable scan policies or capabilities and scan for all the what they call CVEs, known vulnerabilities, as well as other types of things that might not have a vulnerability enumerator, but are potential issues like default passwords or weak passwords. Running this with credentials gives you a better, more thorough scan because you can look at, the software can look at registry keys, internal file services, and things like that, that maybe a remote scan cannot do without credentials. So we highly recommend running a full scan with credentials as much as possible. Another policy that we highlight are configuration benchmarks. And as this nomenclature, XCCDF, is for an extensible markup language. It basically means an XML schema to creating these profiles that you can run against your assets to look at your configurations of those assets against a known industry standard baseline. That's what a configuration policy is in this scope. So for an applicable policy, you would import that configuration setting to scan against those assets. And in this case, Windows Server 2019, we're running a benchmark to look at the security configuration of those Windows 2019 assets. So for this illustration, we'll go back and run our vulnerability scan. Next thing is to identify how we're going to reach the targets. As we talked earlier, if we can reach those assets through a built-in scanning engine from this console, we'll use this. We could also select a remote scanner. So if we have a scanner inside a customer two's environment, we could select that scanner and instruct that scanner to execute scans against those assets it can find and return the results through that scanning engine. So for our illustration, we'll run a remote scan. And we can select our targets either through an imported list. We can manually enter targets in terms of by IP address or IP range or CIDR block. We can also do a discovery scan to pull those hosts in and then use that discovery scan to pull those hosts in from that list. We can also select to connect to Active Directory to pull in assets. So there's a number of options here for identifying your hosts. So in this example, we'll use a CIDR block that we scan this internal network, reaching in the scanning engine we've selected. It is recommended using credentials. So this would be where we would enter our credentials to be used for administrative rights or not administrative rights with the proper credentials that we need to be able to reach the target and reach file services and things like that. Conversely, you can use Saint's Credentials Manager to preload those credentials inside of our Credentials Manager And rather than having to share those credentials across the teams, you can just select to use the stored credentials when they're available. In this instance, we would just create our credentials manually, but the scan job is created. There are a lot of advanced settings within Saint. By default, Saint's scanning methodology will tune these settings as best we need based on the targets and the performance capacity of the scanning engine and management console that we're using. One popular configuration setting is email notification. So when a scan is completed, you would enter the email address, choose to send the email with a pre-canned Saint report template in a format and give it the attachment name and the subject. And when the scan completes, it'll package that information up using that report template you select and send it. The last step is just to create the schedule. Do we want to scan immediately? Do we want to schedule this for later? Or do maybe a recurring schedule where we scan once and then we set up a recurring scan to do this every month or once a quarter, and we can do that recurring scan. The scan window is an ability to be able to work within your service level agreements or within your team's capabilities and your policies when you can scan and when you can't. So maybe, for example, we know we do backups from 6 p.m. to midnight, so we want to run scans from midnight to 6 a.m. And so if you set up a scan to run at midnight and at 6 a.m. that scan is not completed, it will pause when it reaches the end of that scan window and then resume when the next window is open. So it's just a way to be able to not only schedule these scans, but control when scan activity is happening. So once we set our scan job up, you'll see we already have a number of scans that we run for a few customers. We'll be able to see the information as far as the policy that we used and when we created it, when it was last run. But you can also see when all scan activity is occurring. And for example, this one we just created is now running. Most of these are finished. So you can always go back here and look at scan status, as well as look at your ongoing schedules across your domain to find out week at a glance, month at a glance, or even within a day, what you have scheduled, whether something has been scheduled and completed or something is active, scheduled for later. So once we have our scans running, we can look at scan status through the details button and find out what's going on in terms of its history. We have a running scan, so we can look at an ongoing status file. We can get quick information on what targets that we're scanning. So it's just a way to really quickly find out what's going on with the scan. So once a scan is complete, there are a couple of different ways that we can look at things within the Saint UI. First of all, we can look at scan dashboards, and we just select the data filter that we want to use. In this case, as we talked about, running different types of scans and then consolidating data quickly without having to run different reports, one for each type of scan. In this example, for this customer, we've run 4 different scans, a couple of different configuration scans, a software inventory scan, and we scanned their AWS resources. So once we have those scan jobs selected, we can look at what scan activity that we have for these and what scan has been completed. So in this case, I'd want to consolidate one single report using all of these scans that I just ran. So it'd be 5 scan results for these 4 scans and scan jobs. And that would be my data that's in focus, what I'm trying to do. So once I have that data in focus, then I can create my report. So again, we've already selected the data to be used. And Saint has a built-in compliance policy called Cyber Essentials that you can use that'll pre-configure the introduction and the heading and a few things like that to help understand the scope of the report and the requirements behind Cyber Essentials, much like we talked about in the introduction. So I can create this report, or I can give it my own name. PDF is a standard output format. However, if you want to import data into a spreadsheet or consolidate data for other things, you can do an XML or CSV. If you want to create a Word document and use that as a baseline to format it, maybe a different report or put your own background, headings, sections, those type of things, formatting, you can use an RTF output as well. So those four really become the most commonly used: PDF, CSV, XML, and the RTF. In this case, we'll keep our PDF output. By default, we have some report settings for charts and graphs. You can go through this list and add any number of charts and graphs to your report output. Maybe I want to include both severity ratings, a historical severity rating, as well as CVS version 3. CVS version 4 is now supported, so we can also include all the different severity ratings if we want to do so, or we can remove those. So we can have total control of how we want to control the output. Vulnerabilities by severity level. If you're using Saint's risk capability, you can also include different risk ratings and how you want to compute those. So a number of capabilities for different bar charts, pie charts, gauges. Within lists, the same thing. What information do you want to include about your host or the vulnerability summaries? You can control the columns for your hosts as well as the vulnerabilities. In this case, we have some default settings. You can also, for vulnerabilities, include additional information, such as in addition to the CVSS score, which is the vulnerability severity, maybe for the purpose of this report, I would like to include whether exploits were available. Then I'll add another column and get information from CISA that tells me that whether there's any exploits have been exploited in the wild. So this is a CISA known exploited value. And so the information would not only give me the vulnerability and the severity of the vulnerability, but give me some threat intelligence to communicate either internally to the organization or as an assessor, additional information and guidelines that I can provide to the organization in terms of threat intelligence. So the configuration and the options are totally up to you. So by default, we don't include the patch detail. We try to keep the reports as efficient as possible in terms of number of pages, but you can choose to use as much information as you want in the detailed sections, whether you want to use full patch information and include more details in your detailed tutorials. In addition to impact and resolution references and the technical details, you could also include background and just select all of the information. Or be more selective and say, I'm really more concerned about the solution and references, the technical detail than the background and impact. Again, totally up to you. Another key element is the heading information. As we talked about in the introduction, we list the information in this template about the background, cyber essentials, and the purpose of this report. But you can also modify that template as well as add additional detail if you choose to do so. The information by default, we includes any kind of active services that we're running and informational detail that might be lesser known issues that may not be high severity vulnerabilities. It might be more informational. Maybe we found this antivirus that was out of date, or maybe the DAT files haven't been run for a while. That wouldn't consider a vulnerability, but might be a risk exposure you want to highlight to your customer or the organization. Advanced settings, for the most part, the settings are set by the standard and set by the template, but you can also modify this. You can create your own header, your own logo if you want for the headers. You can also constrain and filter down what we see in the report. As we talked earlier, Cyber Essentials is mostly concerned about vulnerabilities in a rating of 7 to 10. So you can go in here and filter and say, I only want to include vulnerability findings above 6.9. And by doing that, it will constrain that report down to only those findings. So the pros and cons of that are, if I find findings such as services running, informational items, lesser vulnerabilities in my scan that are not a severity rating or 7 or 10, by setting this filter, they would be filtered out of the report. So that's one option you can do to focus specifically on the Cyber Essentials vulnerability report that is findings of a severity of 7 and above. However, if the goal is to do a comprehensive scan, and in addition, you're including things like the software inventory and those configuration items that didn't meet a industry best practice, then you wouldn't want to set this filter. You'd want to include all those results. And I'll give you some options as far as how to include the results and get to a finding to show how you focus on the severities. But in this instance, if you only filter the results, you wouldn't get the software inventory and the configurations and the lesser severe one. So the last step is just to verify everything in your settings. And if you've made modifications, such as the heading, your severity ratings, maybe the introduction section, you can create a custom template. And rather than having to do this process all over again, is when you recreate the next Cyber Essentials report, you can use this template rather than using the default setting and going through all those steps again. So it's just a quick way to take advantage of all the settings, create your own template from them. So once the reports are done, we can look at the default report that we just created. And in this particular instance, I've done a couple of different reports beforehand to kind of illustrate the different variances between default and how you can further customize them. So in this instance, a default scan will give you some information about the introduction, again, the background of Cyber Essentials, the various levels of vulnerabilities that we found, some top 10 lists, top 5 lists in terms of vulnerable hosts, and the top 5 most often found vulnerabilities, but also an overview. In this case, we scanned about 20 assets, some cloud-based, some internal, and some in VPC and Amazon Web Services. And we're looking at by host, the critical and high vulnerabilities. And in this case, I didn't filter anything out for the lesser ones, so you can see those as well. So then we get to the details, and we can quickly look at those CVS ratings. And in this case, these are services, so they don't have a vulnerability associated with them. So I'm looking at that software list, as we talked about earlier, consolidating our software inventory by host. And we're also looking at vulnerabilities. And in this case, we're using the CVSS score severity rating. So we see the lows, we see the highs, we see the mediums. And if there's any criticals, we'd be able to see those as well. But we're also getting information about the vulnerability and the CVSS scores and links, external links to information about the vulnerabilities. In addition to that, you can also quickly go through the different sections, since this is a PDF document. And you can also quickly go to remediation guidance from those details that we included. And we'll see that this was an Amazon Web Service instance. We have another instance that had a vulnerability with DNS cache snooping, and we see the impact and the resolution and references, and the technical details, all geared to where we're trying to solve and resolve the issues. So in addition to that, we talked earlier about filtering out the content. And in this next example, we've done exactly the same scan, and we're filtering out everything that wasn't a CVSS score of 7 or above. This is strictly a scan geared around mapping to Cyber Essentials vulnerability score classification of looking at findings that were severity ratings of 7 or above. And you'll notice the report is a little bit more lengthy than the previous example, even if we filtered things out, because we've included patch detail, patch information, and more detail in the remediation guidance. So again, the control is to you how much you want to include in your report. The shortest report, obviously, would just be the findings and leaving out patch information and details. Again, what's the purpose of the report? Is it a summary report, or is it more detailed that you can hand off to somebody to do some mitigation, prioritization, and remediate against the results? So another option I'd like to talk about is custom severities. Within Saint, we have the capability to be able to create our own ratings in terms of the way we look at findings. Say, for example, for cyber essentials, we might want to create a severity rating that says, I want a severity rating that's only based on CVSS scores of 7 and above. So create this custom severity of critical and assign it to every vulnerability that has a severity rating of 7 and above. And the advantage to doing that is when I'm creating my report, I have the same information that I had before. But when I get to the details, again, I'm looking at all the details. I didn't filter anything out. I'm still looking at low vulnerabilities, high vulnerabilities, services, software inventories. As we see here, I still see my software inventories, see my any kind of services that are running, and I see my lesser vulnerabilities. But I only focus on the custom severity score. And that's where I'll see my rating of custom severity. So if I go back to the top, you'll see that's a custom severity. In this example, I took out the NIST CVSS score severity rating and put my own in custom severities. Now I could include them both. I could have the custom severity rating and right beside of it include the normal severity rating. And when I get down to vulnerabilities that have severity ratings, I would see critical. And then over to the right, I might see high because that's the severity rating within NIST. And then the CVSS score of 7.5 beside of it. So again, the control is yours. The options are the default setting, which show you everything and be focused on the NIST severity ratings. Using filtering, I'm filtering out the services, software inventory, and the lesser severe vulnerabilities. And using custom severities, I'm including everything. But having a custom severity category gives me highlight of the different findings that are specifically focused on the outcomes or the requirements for Cyber Essentials. There are many other capabilities within Sync products that we didn't get a chance to cover in this demonstration. For more information, please do reach out to us at b.secure@carson-saint.com. We'll be happy to talk to you about your security and your compliance needs. And also remember to follow us. Our web link is provided here, as well as our social network links through X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Thank you for your time.